Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Together Ensemble conference, specifically the side event on the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, accelerating progress towards 2030 through an integrated whole of government approach. My name is Elena Pierce. I am the acting manager in the policy and engagement team under the Sustainability Directorate in Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'll be moderating today's session and with a great group of panelists. And I first would like to start with some housekeeping and a land acknowledgement. So first off, we have interpretation available. Please select the language of your choice. We also will be presenting a slide deck around the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, followed by a panel discussion. So I would first off like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm coming to you from the Ottawa area. I would encourage everyone to take a minute to acknowledge where they are from in their own time. And with that, I will turn now to introducing our panelists. So today we have three panelists. We have Vincent Claassen, who is the Director General of the Sustainability Directorate within Environment and Climate Change Canada. His global perspective has been shaped by diplomatic assignments and work with leaders across sectors and continents. We have Christina Komorski, who is the Director of the Canadian Environmental Sustainability Indicators Program at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And finally, we have Dakota Norris, who is an Indigenous representative on the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada's Sustainable Development Advisory Council. He is a member of the Gwich'in, apologies, Dakota, if I said that wrong, First Nation. He has a Master of Environment and Sustainability. He's a Master of Environment and Sustainability student and coordinator for Northern Indigenous Sustainable Energy Initiatives at the University of Saskatchewan. He is also involved with the Youth Climate Lab, as well as many other initiatives. So thank you to all of our panelists for being with us today. And I will, without further ado, I will turn it over to Vincent, who will provide us with an overview of the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy.
Well, thanks very much, and welcome everyone to this discussion. We're delighted that you're interested in hearing about this strategy that is a very important pillar of Canada's action on the SDGs and a very important companion to ESDC. I do want to say a shout out again to Dakota. It's great to have Dakota here with us. The Minister's Advisory Council is a very important partner, really a critical partner for the Minister of the Ministers who table this strategy in Parliament every 3 years. And it's terrific that we have him with us today. So I'll start on our next slide. Je vais commencer en anglais et je vais poursuivre à mi-chemin en français avec l'interprétation. So as you can see from this slide, that we are not there's not just one player on sustainable development in the Government of Canada. It is a busy landscape. There's a number of federal agencies that have mandates to mobilize Canadians to take action on sustainable development. And this reflects the complexity and the breadth of the tasks that we have. In particular, Employment and Social Development Canada published its national strategy for the 2030 agenda in 2021. Accompanied by a federal implementation plan for that agenda, published in 2022, and that plan sets out roles and responsibilities of departments to achieve those SDGs. In addition, the Treasury Board Secretariat has developed a quality of life framework and is leading the Greening Government Strategy. The piece that I'm going to focus on today, obviously, is the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, or the FSDS, that me and my colleagues here at Environment and Climate Change Canada have responsibility for, on behalf of our minister, but for the entire Government of Canada. It's not an Environment Canada strategy, it is a Government of Canada strategy. It's also an exciting year, given that we just published last November the 2022 to 2026 strategy that is a governance model for sustainability that is more ambitious than ever. So I'll take it to the next slide. The Federal Sustainable Development Act, which is legislation that was amended not so long ago, sets out the legal framework for developing and implementing a new strategy every 3 years. Departments and agencies that are subject to the Act must contribute to its development. And when the strategy is tabled in the House, is adopted, they must in turn develop departmental sustainable development strategies that implement and that support the implementation of the strategy across the entire government apparatus. So it is a very deep and profound piece of the Government of Canada's architecture. And it changed, as I said, with amendments that came into force in December of 2020. Some key amendments changed its scope, particularly a mandate that now extends to more than 99 federal organizations that contribute and have to help deliver the federal strategy in their mandates, and 2 additional organizations that now contribute on a voluntary basis. In addition, a very big change from 2020 is that the focus of the Act has changed from environmental sustainability to sustainable development decision-making writ large, and that means social elements, economic elements, and a much broader, more integrated view of sustainable development, which is, of course, what the SDGs are all about. This strengthened Act also establishes 7 core principles to be included in the strategy. They guide the development of the FSDS goals, targets, indicators, and organization strategies, and they are, just looking at them here, the government should integrate environmental, social, and economic aspects of sustainability in its decision-making, that it is a continually evolving concept, that collaboration, intergenerational equity, and openness and transparency are key elements of any approach to sustainable development. And of course, involvement of Indigenous peoples is essential, and we'll hear more about that. And finally, a results and delivery approach helps ensure accountability and progress towards the strategy's goals. So moving to public consultations, our Act requires that each strategy be informed by a very robust public consultation. So a year ago, we had public consultations over 4 months on the draft. We received over 700 comments from Canadians, 50 long submissions from the public, trade associations, academia, advocacy groups, nonprofits, provinces, territories, and municipalities, and they were carefully considered when we took that back to departments and shaped the final strategy, which was very different than the draft. We had 17 public webinars, bilateral meetings, performed targeted outreach with key stakeholders, ran a photo contest to engage Canadians on their visions for sustainable development, and we got a lot of very interesting feedback, as I noted. Many of the comments discussed socioeconomic concerns in Canada. These range from rising living costs to housing market, calls for the federal government to take more urgent action on climate change, tackle biodiversity, steps to decarbonize. We also heard about the importance of applying a distinctions-based approach from our Indigenous stakeholders when we're addressing the priorities and challenges of Indigenous knowledge, self-governance, and support for Indigenous ownership and leadership in projects ranging from energy to resource development. And finally, lots of feedback from youth on climate literacy, training and employment opportunities, and engaging them in decision-making. Prochaine diapositive, les objectifs. Donc, la stratégie.
The strategy for 2026 is the first to look at the 17 objectives of the United Nations. By looking at the federal strategy, the strategy complements what the national strategy encourages and piloted by the minister, as well as a federal plan which accompanies it. The next slide. So let's look at it more closely to have a better idea to see how the strategy targets goals. 17, to reinforce partnerships to promote a global movement in favor of sustainable development. We want to advance this objective. The strategies are completed by engagements, specific engagements in ministerial strategies in development. Each organization must have its own strategy and must develop it to present it to Parliament the next year and to report on it. In the ministerial strategies, the departments must show what they will do and how they will measure the results. They're included in the global strategy. Next slide. All the goals has a timeline and are measurable. In laws, it's not always easy, but we are insisting on this. The strategy is a national strategy, 52 goals that are included in the global strategy and 60 other goals. As much as possible, the federal strategy looks at the quality of life and how things affect people. We make sure that the totality of these strategies be understandable, aligned, and promote the big objective, which is sustainable development. The federal strategy that we have shared has 27 indicators, and we're going to speak of it longer in our discussion. Next slide, the electronic strategy. Since we are less and less in a paper document world, to help Canadians to easily understand, to know how they can contribute to the strategy, we have an electronic strategy. It's interactive. You can easily find the content which corresponds to what you are looking for. For example, you can go by objective, by who's involved, with whom the government is collaborating, by organization, federal organization, where the federal government is active geographically, and we put into place updates so that you can follow the progress. And we can also sort by the fields that the federal government is interested in. So I'm going to finish here. I'm going to tell you that how you can communicate with us, and we hope that we found this interesting.
Always keen to hear your thoughts on this strategy, whether it's through social media, the e-strategy, our inbox. We do have an inbox. This is obviously a core principle is continuous improvement, but also continuous dialogue with people who are engaged in sustainable development so that we can shape the next strategy so it's even better than the last. So thank you for that, and we'll start the questions.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and thank you for that 10-minute presentation. That's great. It gives more time for some discussion amongst the panelists, and obviously, hopefully we'll also have some time left to ask some questions to the audience. So as I mentioned earlier, I am joined by 3 exceptional panelists. So obviously you've heard from Vincent. We'll now have Christina and Dakota join us, and we'll start the conversation. So I'll just wait for it to be spotlighted so that we can see everyone. We're good? Yeah. Perfect. So the first question I have is to Dakota. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how is the federal sustainable development strategy accelerating Canada's progress towards the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you. In my perspective, as one of the Indigenous representatives on the council, I think it's through basically, as Vincent was just saying, continuous engagement. So we often talk about continuous improvement, but through continuous engagement with the council representatives, as well as through the public engagements that are happening online, et cetera. Basically, with each iteration of the strategy, we get to improve it that much. And often, from my perspective, again, it's not about increasing the amount of development or increasing the size of the metrics we have and things like that. It's about creating or enhancing the connections between them. So understanding, we want X amount of people to, enter a green space every year. Well, instead of just increasing that year over year, we ask ourselves, why aren't more people accessing them? What are some of the barriers they have? What are some of the reasons they might have to want to do that sort of thing. So through that continuous engagement, we can continually basically increase the strength of the connections amongst all the different sustainable development goals. And that's how I see this basically improving year over year.
Great. Thanks a lot for that. Great answer. Vincent, from the federal perspective, do you have something to add on in terms of how the FSDS helps to progress and achieve the SDGs?
Sure. So I think it's actually interesting to remember that the Federal Sustainable Development Act was the result of a private member's bill from an opposition party that put this bill forward saying, we want the government to set targets and to measure its performance. So it's about accountability. And what it does is it requires the government, forces the government to think about its priorities for sustainable development, put them out there and report on its progress. So that is, I think, the dynamic that creates by requiring a government, which is, obviously not the only actor in sustainable development, but the federal government is a very, very influential actor in sustainable development in Canada and around the world. The fact that we have a legal requirement to set targets, to say we're going to do things and to measure performance and to be scrutinized by the public, Parliament, and the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, that sets in motion, I think, a process that does accelerate our focus on these goals and on these targets and our ability to achieve them. I think that it is much more powerful than what it would be if we didn't have that legislative requirement. And of course, the engagement piece, as Dakota noted, the fact that we are engaging, we are required to engage during the consultation draft period and throughout, that creates what we hope is a virtuous cycle of putting forward targets and indicators and engaging with Canadians to keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak, and that we're conscious of our progress or where we are not making enough progress, and that we are moving towards those goals together.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vincent and Dakota, for that. I know for myself, I've been in the space of the SDGs for a decade now, I think, and I'm dating myself, I guess. And it's really great to now see something that's more concrete and saying that this is how the federal government is responding to it. So, and many of your points, Vincent, I think really translate into that sort of day-to-day piece that is one of those key folks in the initiatives is the Canadian Environmental Sustainability Indicators, which is led by Christina. And so to you, Christina, so the whole of government approach, so bringing together sustainable development goals, the targets, the milestones, the implementation strategies, a lot of things there across 101 federal organizations. And, that's a big leap from where the strategy was a few years ago when there was, just under 50. So with that in mind, it must be challenging in terms of monitoring and reporting. And how do you, with your team through SESI, do that transparently measure and report progress?
Thanks. Yeah, indeed, that's a huge part of this process and piece of the puzzle. It's not just about drafting a strategy and setting a bunch of goals, but as Vincent said, having really clear, measurable targets as well, and then following up on those year over year to ensure that we are actually making progress against them, or if we're not, where are the issues and the weaknesses that need to be continued to be built upon. So I'm the director of a program called Canadian Environmental Sustainability Indicators, SESI in English. That was the slide, ICDE en français. That is, I think, one of the biggest sources of those indicators in the FSDS. Obviously, it goes right across the federal government and takes indicators and data from many different departments on different issues, but on the sort of environmental pillar, shall we say, of the sustainability strategy on issues like fresh water, biodiversity, endangered species, GHG emissions, air quality, that kind of thing. The indicators tend to come from my program, which is entirely open and transparent to the public, to everyone. Anybody can go on our website and click on the close to 70 indicators that we have there that are updated on a rolling basis throughout the year. So some it might be every 2 years, some annually, whatever. But every month, new indicators or updated indicators are being put there that show, based on the latest data that we have, how is water quality in rivers across Canada, or what are our GHG emissions tracking like, or what is the status of various species at risk, or what have you, so that we can constantly keep an eye on and monitor how are we doing at progressing toward those targets. And it's not just the sort of key message. There are, depending on the level of detail that you want and the level of expertise and interest you have in a particular issue, you can dive right into the long indicator reports. Many of them have interactive elements like maps and graphs that you can say, okay, I want to dive down to my province or my region and see how these indicators look for my area specifically. And you can even download the pure data, the tables and the exact measurements, the pages and pages of Excel spreadsheets and so on that enabled us to come up with these indicators and to say, okay, yeah, last year at this site, the level of this contaminant was X and this year it was Y. So we really do try to be as open and public about that as possible. So it doesn't feel like just, the government grading its own homework, that really it's well substantiated in fact and science based.
That's great. I mean, the more that we're able to actually demonstrate that we're making progress, or that we're not making progress, is really critical to the advancement and the achievement of the SDGs. So thank you very much for that. Dakota, I'd like to turn it back to you in terms of your role and the Minister's Sustainable Development Advisory Council. Now, as Vincent mentioned earlier, the Federal Sustainable Development Act, was revised in 2020 and approved, and it increased the number of Indigenous representatives from 3 to 6. So this consultation process that we undertook last year had more engagement across national Indigenous organizations as well as from individuals. And so, how are you involved and what issues were you able to bring to the table? And why do you think it's important, these issues are important to accelerating towards the achievement of the SDGs?
Yeah, well, just with your first, or as you've pointed out, Indigenous perspectives are very diverse, and obviously we're heading in the right direction, adding more representatives on the council. Something that I advocated for a lot was basically making the methodology behind the federal sustainable development strategy, how it's developed, who's been engaged, what decisions were made, et cetera, more concrete, more specific. Because as an Indigenous person, there's over 600 First Nations in Canada, and the government has committed to a distinctions-based approach for, Métis, Inuit, First Nations, and all the very diverse realities, values, perspectives that they have. So in being more specific with the methodology, we can basically capture what values have been put into this strategy, what decisions were made, because, those change depending on who you're asking, those change year over year. And it's really important to see basically what fed into creating this strategy. So that's like one thing that I advocated for, really push for, and I think we're making a lot of progress for that. In general, just trying to help clarify, add, make more ambitious milestones. So one example was with affordability and nutritious food, it's labeled as a short-term, or it was labeled as a short-term target that data would start being collected on in 2026. And for me, that's not a very short-term target. Something to keep in mind, and I'm sure we all know this, but a good reminder is that, as we're strategizing and collecting data and stuff, people right now are hungry, they are poor, they're et cetera. So it's really important to try and do what we can to start not only implementing, but seeing how the implementation is going. And again, I think we're the reaction to a lot of this feedback is immediate. So it's really good to see that things are changed, things are heard and stuff with the strategy. Increasing engagement. So a lot of communities are unaware of or unable to engage with not only the strategy itself, but all the programs and funding and things that influence it. A lot of times the communities or the individuals with capacity to, say, apply for funding or programs already have a lot of capacity, whereas the communities who don't just aren't going to hear about or won't be able to apply for those sort of things. So being really intentional about how we're engaging, who we're engaging. You mentioned, national Indigenous organizations as well as individuals. That's really great, but communities have, again, their own realities, their own values, their own perspectives that aren't necessarily going to be captured in a pan-Indigenous perspective or with individuals like myself. I try my best to share my own lived experience and the experience from working and researching and stuff, but I'm only one person, and that is very much a limitation, one that, we may not ever overcome, but adding more perspectives, being more intentional with engagement, those sort of things can help. Increasing the connections across the SDGs. So a lot of the SDGs, they're obviously very interrelated. And I think adding things like call out boxes, like little graphics that kind of link Indigenous perspectives and chapters to each other can really help visualize that. And I think that feedback was incorporated. So again, using the example of green spaces, I noticed there was a target for how many times a person enters a green space, like a park or something, per year. And for me, I think of my parents who, they have various physical ailments and other limitations, even though Saskatoon, where I live, is filled with green space, tons of green space. They don't access it very often. So we have to ask ourselves, how frequently are people entering these spaces? Are they doing it? What is the seasonality of how they're engaging with it? What are the limitations to them engaging with these spaces? So those are the sort of connections that I was talking about earlier, adding those perspectives and things. And then lastly, I think reflecting on our own perspectives. So again, just asking, how did we get here in terms of the need for sustainable development? What are the perspectives, the values that led us here? And what are the ones that are feeding our current situation? And what are the ones that we might need to rely on a little more to sort of aim for more true sustainable development? So that was a lot of information, but that
was great. It was great. It was really telling a story about the various levels of engagement and interaction and contributions that we need to look at. I when you mentioned Saskatoon, I think of, Saskatoon having the largest urban reserve in all of Canada, right? And there's what's that how does that play out, right? And how do we make sure that those voices are heard? Because it's not always thought about urban reserves. You think about remote reserves, for example, right? As just one angle. You're talking about local communities, for example. Really interesting. Just a last point on that. Do you see any other, you've covered a lot of things, but is there anything that you would say we could, ensure that we can get more Indigenous leadership into the conversation? I mean, you've named up a number of things, but maybe pinpointing one or two things that are really critical.
Sure.
Or approaches that we should take.
Yeah. Two things. In some areas we see what's called like a strategic partnership initiative. In Alberta, for example, I was speaking with someone yesterday who works for a strategic partnership initiative that tries to essentially bring together all the various federal departments, the funding and programs they have, and match them to projects so that Indigenous communities or other communities in general don't have to, apply for 10 different funding things, 10 different programs, track all the different information out there. These strategic partnership initiatives among the government can really help both sides, enhance capacity, because it ties together not only the funding and reduces the labor involved, but also the knowledge and the connections. You can connect people to other opportunities and things. So I think seeing those sort of things implemented more, including through the Indigenous Climate Leadership Initiative, which is being developed, would be really great. And secondly, so something I didn't see referenced much, if at all, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm sure there's obviously connections with the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, but seeing that done more intentionally would be, I think, really helpful to just provide more structure and framework for the perspectives and the values that we already know matter for Indigenous peoples.
Great, thank you very much. Either panelists want to just add anything to that, or are you good?
Well,
Yeah, that's it.
I just want to say, I think I really appreciate that the depth of those observations. And I mean, it's and it just reminds us how challenging this is for a federal strategy. But what I take from that, Dakota, as well, is how, like, ultimately we want this to impact the lives of Canadians, right? And how do we shape a federal strategy that is about basically what targets and measures of performance will we set for ourselves, but how do we translate that into meaningful impacts for Canadians on the ground? And how do you, it is very hard, right? Because we're trying to capture the most important initiatives and priorities of the government of Canada. And yet there are about 40 million different ways to live this, right? So anyway, I just have to say, I found that very important to bring it to the level of communities, and that's a challenge, for certainly for our strategy. But I found that very thoughtful. Thank
you, Vincent. So our next question's for all the panelists, and I'm going to start with Dakota, just because it relates more to the base that he's coming from. So the strategy is for implementation by federal government organizations. What do you see as the impacts on academia and civil society organizations?
Yeah, I responding a little bit, connecting to what you just said, Vincent. Absolutely, this is a challenge, and it's not realistic, I think, for 40 million perspectives to be included in this strategy. Ultimately, everyday citizens, it's the federal government's responsibility to create and implement this strategy. So there is a challenge. However, I think there's an opportunity to create essentially a community of practice, I guess you could say, as we're creating more data, academic organizations, civil society organizations can utilize that, or maybe we can identify gaps together and figure out who can fill those gaps with data, case studies, those sort of things. But really just considering the reciprocal relationship, all of this is supporting, Canada, but how can Canada support this strategy as well? Who are the leaders? Who are the institutions? Where are the places that we can connect to have these conversations so that perspectives like the ones I'm sharing today can be shared? And also, we can work together essentially on figuring out how to go forward in implementing and creating a better strategy every time we do one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dakota. And I'm going to turn it to Christina, and just, that piece around data and this importance of disaggregated data, especially with, measuring things properly and the SDGs and leaving no one behind, which is essentially the whole idea of the SDGs. So what do you see about that connection, in particular with academia, I would think, but also with civil society?
Mm-hmm. I very much agree with what Dakota was just saying, is that it's, first and foremost our role to do that homework, so to speak, but to then share it and interact with others, and hopefully society more generally can benefit from using that information. So that's why I think it's so important that we're transparent about not just what our goals are, but what data we have to back up, what has actually been done, and the methodologies that we use to make the various calculations, so that others can agree or disagree, can go in and do that analysis themselves and confirm whether it makes sense to them, or drill down and say, okay, but in my community or my province, there's more work to be done, and how can we use that information to actually spur more action where it's needed, or to really validate what's been going on and whether it's been effective. But you really can't do anything without solid information about where you stand in the first place. I think over the course of the pandemic, everybody sort of got a sense of that in their daily lives. I was having conversations with family members and neighbors and, passersby about, what were the transmissibility rates of latest variants and hospitalization rates and stuff. Everybody became sort of data savvy because it was important in the decision making about how we lived our daily lives. I think the same is true in a lot of ways on the environmental side. Sometimes it's over a longer time horizon or a much bigger picture, but you really can't make any good decisions or progress without having a really solid and ongoing sense of where things currently stand.
Thanks a lot. And Vincent, do you have anything you'd like to add on that one in terms of the engagement in particular with academia and civil society?
Well, I think that everyone, everyone's going to bring some value added to this from their perspective. I think the data piece is absolutely critical, but it's also a question of perspective. And we're obviously responsible for the federal shaping this around the federal government's actions, but for it to be meaningful and relevant, it has to account for how it's perceived by key players around the table. So I think the data and sort of the lived experience and the real kind of the on the ground experience is something we have to be very mindful of when we shaped up something that's supposed to have ultimately an impact, a positive impact on the quality of life of Canadians.
Thank you. And that just goes right to the heart of where the act is supposed to go, right? Of the quality of life. We're improving the quality of life of all. So thank you very much. So we're going to now open the floor to the audience in terms of how you see this data being useful to you, and are there policy and or data gaps that you would like to see filled? And so I'm opening that up for the chat box. So if folks want to answer through there, or if they'd rather raise their hand. If there are any questions to the audience, to the panelist, we have a few minutes to take questions. So I've posed that question to you, but we're also welcoming questions back to the panel. So I see one, Mohammed.
Thank you very much. This was really wonderful and useful to know about the environmental indicators. I just finished my master's degree at Trent University in studying Canada's kind of localization strategy for the SDGs and how a few cities across the country are trying to measure and assess their progress on the SDGs. And one of the challenges I saw that in summer 2021, the Canadian government released the Canadian Indicator Framework, which is a distillation of the 231 indicators. It was, in my view, a wonderful start to that, towards that end. But if you look at, and this is, I'm going to get wonky a little bit on the data side, if you look at the SDG Data Hub, which mimics the indicators in the CIF, it's only disaggregated to provincial levels for most of the 76 indicators. So if you go and try to get, for example, data for some municipalities, you will not find that on the SDG Data Hub. You will only find provincial data, Ontario, Quebec, BC, Saskatchewan, etc. But you won't find, in many cases, data for, basically Peterborough or Kitchener-Waterloo or London, Ontario, or Quebec City. I think if we want communities to engage, and I believe that the achievement of the federal sustainable development strategy will be kind of ground up and communities helping the federal government get those data and really advance those initiatives locally, that data needs to be disaggregated to that local level so that communities can see where they are on the Canadian Indicator Framework and design initiatives that, basically will get them from where they are today to where they want to be in 2030. I think that that's, in my view, imperative. And I really hope that the folks in the audience and also those who are, working on the CIF you guys could potentially reach out to them. I'm more than happy to write them if they're willing to receive my email. But I'm cognizant that oftentimes these emails just go, way below anyone's priority and never get attended to. But thank you very much. This was really useful.
Thank you, Mohammed. Vincent or Christina, I look to either one of you if you'd like to comment on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think it was really a question so much as a comment, but I wholeheartedly agree that the more data we have and the better we can disaggregate it, the more informative and useful it can be on a local basis. We do have contact with the folks who work on that SIF portal I think you're talking about. And in fact, there are some SESI indicators in there. So definitely there's always room for continuous improvement on those. You might find some things in the SESI suite that aren't in the SIF or even in the FSDS. In fact, we have a lot more indicators on there too that could be of interest, but it's something that we always, look to improve as much as we can insofar as the data is available, of course. But thank you for that. And I can, for my part, assure you that any emails that go to the generic FSDS or SESI inboxes definitely do get read and attention paid to them. So if that's reassuring at all, we always appreciate feedback and comments, positive, negative, whatever the case may be. It's always constructive.
I'll go back to Vincent.
Yeah. So on good rules, I'll start with the positive and then work to the perspective criticism. I just want to add, thank you. Very, very helpful point. It just so happens that the Canadian Indicator Framework is going to be reviewed in the coming year, and that's something that we're going to engage with in our colleagues at Statistics Canada. And I don't think we mentioned this, but the Canadian Environmental Sustainability Indicators Program is also undergoing a review right now. So if you feel that there are things that we need to cover, that's obviously one dimension of sustainability, the environmental sustainability angle, but we are carefully reviewing those indicators right now. And as Christina said, we can't do everything to a disaggregated level. That actually is a little bit more the mandate of Statistics Canada in setting up the SIF and disaggregation. But anyone here who wants to look at our indicator suite, the SESI indicators, and has views on where there might be gaps or things that are interesting to develop further, we would be delighted to hear from you.
Great, thank you. So I'm not seeing any other questions at this point, and we actually are coming up.
I have a hand. I see a hand. Sherry's iPhone.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Vincent. We'll go to Sherry.
Thank you. Just very quickly, my question is about the last assessment done by COSWIC, and this is in regards to our endangered species. And I just wanted to just make a quick comment that of the results and assessments of the 873 species that are critically imperiled, these aren't exact figures at this point, because it's a study that lags. A number of the lags include the fact that there will be some more contributions on protection of biodiversity with these indicators that you have provided. So I'm just wondering, we're sort of looking at rankings, but where are we, and where can we find more reporting by our academics? As I see that many are leaving our institutions because our governments aren't supporting these types of indicators, and we need these academics to stick around.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm looking to, is there any comments from Vincent or Christina on this?
I mean, I guess I can't really comment on the academic retention piece. I can say that that is a theme that we have a couple of indicators on. Actually, we have a number of wildlife and habitat indicators in our suite, including some specifically on species at risk. And I think it is fair to point out that that's an area where, you know, we have some tough work to do. It's not there progress in some areas, some species and some habitats, but not across the board yet. So I don't know if you have seen, or if you want to go on the SESI website and take a look at, for example, the species at risk population trends indicators, see to what extent you think that jives with the COSWIC report. But if your basic point was this is something that we need to keep an eye on and continue to invest time and resources into monitoring carefully, again, I completely agree.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed, I see your hand up, but I'm not sure if you still have another question or no. Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
I'll
just, it was a very quick comment, because there's a wonderful example that I think Vincent mentioned, that it is in the hand of Statistics Canada. The Census Viewer Data Program is a wonderful example to look at, because it's a GIS map that disaggregates to a level of census tract. If we can get something of the Canadian Indicator Framework that mimics what Statistics Canada already does for a lot of the statistics. I loved working with the Census Data Viewer program. It's amazing, amazing, amazing tool. And I would love to see the folks at Statistics Canada do something similar for the CIF. That would just be wonderful, I think, for communities across the country.
Thank you, Mohammed. I do see a question from Kate Potter. Will there be a public consultation or specific time period for reviewing the indicators? Are you referring to the SESI indicators or the FSGS, or kind of both? Kate? Not sure. So anyway, so Christina, maybe you can answer if there's in terms of the piece around SESI.
Yeah, so over the course of this year, in the next few months, we're looking at our SESI suite to see if there are any indicators there that are maybe a little bit passé that we don't need to keep updating because they're not really of use, and should we be reinvesting and maybe developing new indicators in some areas that aren't well covered yet. We welcome any input on that. And I think there was a link earlier in the chat that Ellie put up to our website. There's also an email address on there where you can reach out to us. And we're always actually interested in building relationships too with people, sort of environmental indicator experts across the country. If you have an academic project or something coming up along those lines, or you have input on the technical side of things, on methodology, or just generally on what we do and don't cover, we're super interested in hearing from all of you on that, from anyone, whether it's just the general public, academia, civil society groups, what have you. So don't hesitate to reach out and we can take up the conversation individually.
Thank you. Okay, so I see two more questions and we're running a few minutes, probably too late, but so I'll try and answer the first one and the second one. And then I'm going to turn it to Vincent for some closing comments. Again, you have our information around how to contact us. So if we haven't answered your questions, or if you have fully, or if you have other questions, please send them to us. So the one question that I'm seeing is around the voluntary national review. So that the voluntary national review is the report that Canada is putting forward at the high-level political forum next month. And that is being led by Employment and Social Development Canada. Canada will be reporting and profiling its work around goals 1, 5, 8, 13, and 17. The UN is also looking at reviewing other goals, but Canada has also spotlighted all 17 goals, sorry. And that report will be available when the minister tables it to the UN next month at the high-level political forum. There was a process where Canadians as a whole were invited to comment, and so those comments were integrated as where relevant. In terms of the specific engagement of First Nation communities, we continue to, through the Sustainable Development Advisory Council, as well as other mechanisms, we try and find opportunities to engage to ensure we have an Indigenous perspective in the work that we're doing. So that's always an ongoing process, always looking for new ways or new organizations to think about when we go through these processes. The consultation period for the next federal sustainable development strategy, of which the period will be 2026 to 2029, will take place in about 2 years' time from now. So in the meantime, we're always looking for opportunities to promote the strategy and the work of the federal government. But with that, I won't take any more maybe of Vincent's final comments. Je vais demander la question en français. En conclusion, y a-t-il des lacunes dans la stratégie?
So in conclusion, is any gaps in the current strategy that will be treated or taken care of in the next strategy? So that's a little question before we end. Thank you for this difficult last question. Are there gaps? Of course, there are things where we could do a little bit better. It's the first time we've elaborated a 3-dimension strategy: environmental, economic. There's also inequalities in terms of indicators or targets. It's important to have total uniformity with targets and indicators, but I think it's the first time we tabled this strategy that is for sustainability is pretty good. On the economic side, we've mentioned there's a cultural component to develop, and social. We have targets on poverty, among others, violence against women. So this is progress, but in the general equilibrium of the strategy, we have to add zones to explore that have to be explored. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's also the interconnections in the links between different dimensions and targets in the end, we're trying to make that readable, understandable for the general
a
population.
transparent and an accessible strategy that's clear to people. So we can't, obviously, we can't map sustainability for the entire country from the national and community level. There are, of course, limits to what we can do, but I feel that the strategy, I think a lot of people feel that the strategy that we tabled last fall was a very big step forward in the trajectory of Canada's sustainability strategies, and I'm very confident that we're going to we'll see even more gaps as we take inside our team. We're having a big scrutiny of it again next week on what lessons do we take from our experience last time. Where are some of those gaps? So we're also going to count on Canadians to tell us where they see some of those gaps, both in the formal consultation and between now and 2025, I believe, when we would launch that consultation. So I would put the question back to folks to tell us where you see gaps, and we'll be happy to address that and continue talking about it the way we have today. Alors, je veux juste dire merci d'être là avec nous et on est toujours à l'écoute.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you, Dakota and Christina. I hope you found it. I hope everyone here found it interesting and informative. Again, as Vincent said, we're always looking to hear from folks. You have the contact information in the chat. Please do reach out. And especially as we prepare to launch that consultation period in about 2 years' time, we're always open to opportunities to engage with you on this topic. So with that, I will close the session. I know some sessions start at 2 o'clock. So thank you very much for your participation and have a good day.